Could Canada really cut off the power to the United States? Could a trade war escalate to the point where one of the most critical energy sources in North America is turned off? For decades, Canada has been considered one of the US's most reliable allies, supplying vast amounts of energy and resources. However, recent tensions between the two neighbors, sparked by President Donald Trump's tariffs, have put this long-standing relationship to the test. As the trade war intensifies, Canada has issued a startling threat. It could shut off the flow of electricity to the US. This isn't just an empty threat. It comes after months of frustration on both sides. Under President Trump, the US imposed 20% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which greatly upset the balance of trade. Canada's response has been swift, and the stakes are high. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's bold statement that Canada might cut off electricity exports is shaking the foundations of the US-Canada relationship. With these tariffs hurting Canadians, industries, and exports, cutting off energy supplies is seen as a dramatic but potent form of retaliation. In early March 2025, Premier Ford made an unexpected declaration. He said that if the Trump administration continues with these tariffs, Canada wouldn't hesitate to use its energy resources as leverage. "We'll cut off the electricity. We'll turn off the lights," Ford said, with a smile on his face, signaling that this drastic measure was very much on the table. These comments were made at a press conference, where Ford also mentioned that Ontario was prepared to act swiftly if necessary, giving a clear message that Canada would no longer tolerate unfair trade practices. But why is this such a big deal? To understand, we need to look at Canada's critical role in the US energy market. Canada exports a significant amount of electricity to the US, particularly to the northern regions. In 2023, the US imported about $2.3 billion worth of electricity from Canada, which accounts for a substantial portion of the energy needs in states like New York, Vermont, and others in the Northeast. These areas depend heavily on hydroelectric power from Canadian sources like Hydro-Quebec and Ontario's grid. If Canada were to cut off this supply, American consumers could face rising electricity bills, and some regions might even experience shortages. This energy interdependence is the result of years of infrastructure development and cooperation between the two nations. The Canadian grid is so closely integrated with the US system that simply pulling the plug is not feasible. Energy analysts argue that Canada cannot completely stop the flow of electricity without severe technical challenges. However, the country could reduce the supply or make it intermittent, creating a kind of power play that would force the US to respond. Canada's electricity exports to the US are not just about power. They are also a vital economic resource. The revenue from these exports is important for provinces like Ontario and Quebec. In fact, the economic value of these energy exports is estimated at over $2 billion annually. Cutting off this flow would hurt both countries, but it could also serve as a form of diplomatic blackmail, forcing the US to reconsider its tariff policies. It would be a tough decision for Canada, as losing this revenue would be problematic for the provinces. Still, it might be seen as a necessary sacrifice to make a point to the Trump administration. For Doug Ford and other Canadian leaders, this is not just a threat. It is a response to what they see as unjust trade practices. Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, including steel, aluminum, and agricultural products, have caused significant economic damage. The tariffs were introduced under the guise of national security concerns, but for many Canadians, they seem like an unfair attack on their economy. Trudeau, Ford, and others have made it clear that they will not accept these tariffs and will retaliate in kind if necessary. So, what would be the consequences of a power cut? For the US, a sudden loss of Canadian electricity would be catastrophic, especially in the Northeast. States like Vermont and New York rely heavily on Canada's power exports to meet their energy needs. Vermont, for instance, has an agreement with Hydro-Quebec to supply a quarter of its electricity needs by 2038. If that supply was suddenly cut off, the state could face a significant energy crisis, with costs skyrocketing and potential shortages looming. New York, similarly, has agreements to import power from Canada until 2030. Those agreements could easily fall apart if the political climate between the two nations deteriorates further. The broader economic impact would also be significant. The U.S. imports millions of barrels of Canadian crude oil each day, which is refined into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Cutting off this flow would cause serious disruptions to the U.S. energy market, driving up prices and causing widespread shortages. The Midwest and Great Lakes regions, which are heavily dependent on Canadian energy resources, would be particularly hard hit. On the other hand, the effects on Canada would also be substantial. Losing the revenue from electricity exports would be a blow to the Canadian economy. However, if the crisis continues to escalate, the Canadian government may be willing to accept this loss as a necessary cost for challenging the U.S. administration. It's a high-stakes gamble, and one that could lead to a serious diplomatic confrontation. As the trade war continues, Canada's strategy seems to be one of using its energy resources as a powerful negotiating tool. Premier Ford's comments on March 6, 2025, suggested that Canada was not afraid to use its energy exports to the U.S. as leverage in this trade battle. Ford believes that the 25% tariffs imposed by Trump are entirely unjustified, and he has warned the U.S. that if it continues with these tariffs, Canada will retaliate in ways that could hurt both countries. This is not just about electricity. Ford has also pointed out that Canada could cut off the flow of raw materials like nickel and steel, which are critical to U.S. industries. The potential consequences of such actions would be felt in both nations, creating a lose-lose scenario that could hurt both Canadian exporters and American industries. The economic interdependence between the two countries makes it clear that a prolonged trade war could lead to widespread economic pain. The U.S. government, meanwhile, seems determined to press forward with its tariffs despite the potential consequences. In early March 2025, a White House spokesperson reaffirmed that the tariffs were imposed for national security reasons and that the U.S. would not back down. President Trump is set to address Congress on March 4, 2025, and his speech is expected to reiterate his stance on trade, including the ongoing tariffs against Canada. Despite warnings from senior advisors about the risks of escalating tensions, Trump has made it clear that he sees tariffs as a necessary tool for protecting U.S. interests. But can Canada really follow through on this threat? While energy analysts agree that Canada's power grid is closely integrated with the U.S., they also acknowledge that reducing or limiting electricity exports is technically possible. However, pulling the plug completely would require major infrastructure changes and could take time to implement. Despite this, the very possibility of a power cut is enough to send a strong message to the U.S. about Canada's willingness to defend its economic interests. This situation is a stark reminder of the high stakes involved in global trade and diplomacy. The energy card has always been a powerful weapon, and Canada is now using it to signal that it will not be pushed around by the U.S. trade policies. As the U.S. and Canada continue to spar over tariffs, the fate of the relationship between these two countries will depend on how far both sides are willing to go in their trade war.